Hello, everyone. I'm David, and I'm with Melanie today, and we're interviewing Chris Bruno as part of a Parenting Teen Summit. And so Chris is phenomenal. Chris leads restoration counseling in Fort Collins, Colorado. He also started the Restoration Project, and he wrote the book Man Maker Project. And we love him at Access because he's just been really awesome at helping us think deeply about how to help parents foster the right conversations with their kids and really create the right environment for those meaningful conversations. So Melanie has our first question for you, Chris. I'll let Melanie kick it off.
So the theme of this summit is actually hope. And one of the things that we feel like is easy to lose sight of is hope in the next generation. So we want to know, what about the next generation gives you hope?
Yeah, that is a huge question. And first of all, thanks for having me join you today for this. I just love what Access is doing to help parents have those vital conversations. So thank you so much. Great question. For me, honestly, when we look at the world around us, it's very easy to like you said, be hopeless. But here's the thing that gives me hope. First of all, it is the fact that parents want something better for their kids. And that has been the truth for all generations. We always want something better for our kids. And our kids will want something better for their kids. So the thing is that if we lose a sense of I want something better because we fall into this place of cynicism or sarcasm, that this generation is just worse and it's getting worse and worse, then we actually succumb to the reality that we're creating for our kids. So I love the fact that these kinds of summits are happening and what you're doing with Access, because what you're actually activating is a renewal of hope in the parent, which then renews hope in the child. So that's what gives me hope. The second thing that gives me hope is this idea of intentional parenting, okay? That for a parent to not just be attentional, not give the attention to their children, but to be intentional, which means that I not only am giving you my eyes, but I'm giving you my heart, that I can, and I have a plan for you. That, as Jeremiah talks about, I have a plan for you. I have a vision for you and for your future. That to me gives me hope. When I see a parent take the step into intentional parenting, it totally, totally changes the future for that child and the parent too. So that's what gives me hope.
So let's talk about intentionality in parenting.
Go for it.
I mean, I want to talk about Rites of Passage. So
yes.
I mean, maybe we'll drift here or there, but you're a pro on this. I mean, people have been doing bar mitzvahs and other things like this. And so maybe you could give us some of the history of Rites of Passage, and then through the rest of the conversation, we can talk about ways that parents can foster that, whether it's from a father to a son or a mother to her daughter, or we'll get all of that. So tell me about the history of Rites of Passage.
That's a massive question. You're asking the millennia of information in a few minutes. But basically, the Rites of Passage are in almost every single culture in the world, except for Western culture. So for some reason, we don't have it in the Western culture, but
we don't even have like fake ones, or like maybe sport.
Yeah, I mean, we've got like driver's licenses, and
okay.
The first time you get drunk, or the first time you have some kind of intimacy with somebody. Like there's those kinds of rites of passages, but we don't necessarily have like a rite. Now, the definition of a rite is an intentional process that moves one person from one place to another. Okay. And we have this in the church. We have rites in the church that move our hearts closer to God. We have marriage rites that take you from being single to being covenanted together. So a rite of passage is the process of moving a child from being a child into being an adult. And we don't have those kinds of processes. So African cultures, Native American cultures, Hebrew and Arabic cultures, all these cultures have some kind of deeply rooted, culturally driven process to bring a child into adulthood. And we just don't have that.
So why not? What happened?
A lot of things happened. I think there were several things in the family culture that began to develop. There were several things in the economic culture that began to develop. So one thing particularly that's more in the recent history is the Industrial Revolution. And that is where, the Industrial Revolution, and also a shift in thinking about education. So for Industrial Revolution, we took the father out of the home and took him to the factory to do his work, which removed him from the apprenticeship model that was happening, especially for boys, from father to son, and the generations of passing, blacksmithing or leather working or tent making down from generation to generation. Now the father is in a factory doing something outside of the home, and the whole idea of what father was shifted away from apprenticing your children into making money. And so there was a big shift economically that happened with the Industrial Revolution. And then there's also the shift, I think, in education of we send our children to someone else, somewhere else, to give them the education versus providing them the education in the family or in even the extended family. So we're kind of offshoring a lot of the responsibility for our children all of a sudden, when most of the cultures that have really strong rites of passage have maintained that heritage in the local tribe or family. So
what can we do to bring that back? Or, this is something you've dedicated a good portion of your life to. You've been thinking about, how do we help how does a parent who's listening to this right now help their 12-year-old go through a rite of passage experience? Or what age should you even do that? And what indicators do you notice in your kid?
Well, I think rites of passage should really be from an earlier age, even before 12. So we need to be preparing the child for adulthood. And we have, in especially the Western culture, American culture, this idea of this extended adolescence that I believe, have actually robbed our kids of some of the wealth of experience and responsibility that they should have. So if we can begin to, at an earlier age, say, hey, you're a boy now, but you will become a man. You're a woman or a girl now, and you will become a woman. And having this vision of who they will become, kind of driving how I am engaging with them now, that I think is really, starting at 4, 5, 6 years old, to begin to talk about who they will become, is not the beginning of a rite of passage, but it's the beginning of intentionality. So the first question that you just asked, what can parents do, is, I'm going to come back to my word, intentionality. Can you have a vision for who your child will be, not what they will do vocationally, but who they will be characterologically? How they will move into that woman, into that boy, and what kind of character do I envision them having, and do I feel like God is asking me to instill in my children? And then what will I do in the process of them growing to intentionally create experiences for them to grow those parts of their hearts? So that's a beginning answer, I guess. Go ahead.
Well, how does that look in today's world when we are still kind of in that Industrial Revolution world where the parent does go off to work, or maybe even both parents do, and you don't have as much time with them? What does that look like practically on a day-to-day level or a week-to-week level?
Yeah, it looks like shifting your values and shifting your priorities. It looks like you
That's easy, right? Just shift your values and priorities. No
values, right? I say that, and you joke about that, but I really do think that that's at the core. Is the best thing for me to do for my children to provide a Disney vacation, or is the best thing for me to do for my children to provide some sense of ushering into the rest of their lives? I think that as parents, it is our role primarily to help them become who God made them to be. So this idea of rite of passage or whatever. Now, your question is a real practical one. What does it mean on Monday night when I'm exhausted from work, when the kids have been at school, they're mad their weekend's over, they're frustrated the week is coming, and it's what I call the witching hour. It's kind of that time, the time between times of when everybody is frustrated, exhausted, and just needs to go to bed. What does it look like that? Right?
Yeah, witching hour. What do we do?
What do we do? that's where, if you have the values of I'm going to be intentional, it's taking 15 minutes. It's taking 5 minutes to do something different than what you might normally do. It's setting into your schedule and into your rhythms more of that face-to-face time. That I think, here we're talking big rites of passage and moving from boy to man and all that kind of stuff, but it really happens in miniature moments. It happens in moments where you're tucking your kids into bed. It happens in moments where you've got them, in the seat next to you in the car on the way to soccer practice. It's the focus of the parent to say, I am focusing on your heart as a young person who's becoming an adult. Now I'm going to speak into that, and I've already thought of many things that I want to instill in you, and experiences I want you to have. So,
okay, so you're like actually at your counseling practice right now.
Absolutely.
This is we're catching in the middle of life. You're having a nice drink of cool water there.
It's a counseling office, right?
No, it's great. I like it. So I want you to. So let's pretend that I have a 14-year-old.
Yeah.
And I loved your idea of visioneering, of saying like, speak some kind of character vision into your kid, and you start when they're little, but you can also do it now. Like, what is that normally like? What set me up for that? Like, if I'm saying, all right, just give me the play-by-play. 14-year-old son, here's a dad, and I just want to, speak into him. How do I visioneer that characterological?
Okay. Yeah. How do I visioneer characterological?
I mean, I'm using your big words, so I like them.
So the first thing, David, is I don't want someone to think I start at 14. And I also don't want someone to think that 14, if I have a 14-year-old, that it's too late to start.
Okay.
So, all right. So I want to back it up and say, as a parent of young children, that's when you're not in the pressure point of puberty hitting and then starting to get more independence, and you trying to figure out how am I going to help them go on good dates and figure out this whole work thing and all that. So it's better to start at an earlier age for the parent. And so I'm really a big fan of parents thinking about this when the kids are, like I said earlier, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, of who are they and what do I want for them? So I'm thinking of the character things that are important to me and important to my wife and important to us as a family unit. What is our family motto? What are the things in our family that we are wanting to instill in our children? Okay. That then begins to shape what kind of vacations we take, what kind of things we do in the evening, what kind of rhythms we have at the dinner table, what kinds of times that we have, what kind of play that we do, those kinds of things all throughout their upbringing. So it begins a lot earlier. Now, your question, I've got a 14-year-old, and I realize like he's full on in puberty, and he's ready to, thinking about getting his driver's license, and I'm going crazy on what do I do with him. One of the things that I find parents do is first they panic. All right. So I want to ask for parents not to panic. The second,
step one, don't panic.
The second is that the relationship that you have with your child is the number one piece or value or puzzle piece to anything that you're going to be able to do conversationally. So to spend the time with your child as a 14-year-old, hopefully you've done that along the way, but spend the time with your child so that there is a relationship, so that when you speak, it carries some weight, right? And you actually have some kind of relational capital with your child to be able to listen to you and do some kinds of visioneering and characterological and viewing and that kind of stuff. The other piece I want to say, though, is that a rite of passage is not a one-off event. It is not something that any culture has as a one-off event. It is all about a process over many months of time. So what has happened in our Western culture is that when we have attempted over the last, several decades to do some kind of rite of passage, is we've made it an event focused, where it's like a ceremony or a blessing ceremony or a date with dad or some kind of weekend camping trip or something like that. And we make it all about this one event, when in fact it has to be a whole relational scope over several months. So if you're sitting in my counseling office, you've got a 14-year-old, you don't know what to do with them, I would say, well, we got to start somewhere. So start a process, not find one thing that you're going to do to fix the situation, but think longer term. Okay, think from 14 till 18. What are the next 4 years going to look like on how you're going to do some experiential things with your child? Getting into who are they? What is the story that they are living? What are the character qualities that they already have, and how can you as a parent fan those into flame through a variety of things, and then to very intentionally bless them by speaking words of life to them. And there's so much more I could say about that. That's a whole other talk.
So, but you mentioned experience a couple times.
Yeah.
Like, so should a parent, so you're thinking as a parent, do you plan out something like every month, this is my weekly lunch with my son, or this is my monthly date with my daughter? I mean, what do you mean by experience? Like, you say that it means something. Help me understand what you're thinking and what you're talking about.
Well, in the Manmaker Project book, what I did was I said, we basically got to take a year-long Rite of Passage process and break it down into what I suggested is to 6 different segments. Okay, so 2-month segments. And in those 2-month segments, I'm focusing on one character quality that I really want to talk about with my son. Now, that character quality, there's 6 that I list in the book, but there's 100 possible, and it's you as a parent need to figure out what are the character qualities that we really want to focus on. One of them, for example, is courage. So in that 2-month window, for my son, and then in the book, I talk about how I did create experiences that I went on a camping trip. I made sure that we watched certain movies and had conversations. I made sure that we did some things locally that required courage from him. And courage is not just climbing a boulder or jumping off of a rock into a lake. Courage is having conversations with a stranger. Courage is initiating with a teacher. Courage is a whole bunch of different things. And in those 2 months, I walked with him through several of those, like I said, just minute by minute, small little experiences and then brought meaning to them to say, hey, this is where courage is found. This is what courage is. And trying to build some kind of mental file folder for him to know this is what courage looks like. So when courage is required of me in the future, I have some frame of reference. So to do it, like I said, over a process of a longer period of time and break those 2-month segments into very simple conversations, very simple movies that you reflect on together, very simple experiences that are pretty much everyday experiences, but they mean something different when you as a parent bring the meaning to it.
So I have a question. I think as parents, it can be easy to want our kids to be something or have a vision of who we think they're going to be when they're really young, and then they get older and older and they're not necessarily bent toward that thing we thought they were going to be. I mean, we tend to do it a lot with vocation especially, but I wonder, maybe we want our boys to be super sensitive and emotionally intelligent, and there's one is just not natural for him. So what's the difference between teaching them that and like beating them over the head with it and trying to make them be something that they're not?
Yeah, great question. Particularly with the vocational piece, I think a lot of parents struggle with that. I want my kid to be a doctor. I want my kid to, be an engineer like I am, that kind of stuff. That's not the kind of visioneering that I'm talking about. I think the kind of visioneering that we would want for our kids is this idea of these character qualities. It starts with, however, being a student of your child before you begin to try to lay something on them or have some kind of expectation of them. And when I mean student, it is in the earliest years, they will mimic pretty much anything you do. If you're a fisherman, they will want to be a fisherman. If you like motorcycles, they will want to, if you like doing some yoga or something like that, they will want to try to do yoga next to you on the floor. Like, they want to mirror who you are. But then then sometime around the 8-9-year-old time frame, they begin to have some of their own, and this is like brain development stuff, they begin to have some of their own identity and begin to try some of their own things. And that's where the switch begins to happen of you not teaching them, you're beginning to learn from them. And what are the qualities that they already have? Are they creative? Are they sensitive? Are they brave, right? I have a friend who has a child who's 9 years old, and he's the bravest thing in the world. He'll go up to anybody and talk to him, right? So there's a lot of courage that this little boy has. So for you to be a student of them, but then also to have some level of, the world requires us to have integrity. The world requires us to have follow through and persistence and an understanding of how do we walk through suffering. And those are some of the things that they're just not going to learn on their own. And those are the things I think we as parents need to teach them. So you're right that some kids may be sensitive and some kids not so sensitive. To be a citizen, to be an adult in the world, you do have to have some level of sensitivity, right? Nobody wants to work with someone who's a totally insensitive person, right? So you do have to have some of that. Now, do you go full on into the world of sensitivity and become a counselor and ask them to become a counselor? No, if that's not who they are, but you do need at some level to help them grow the areas that they may be weak in.
So let's talk about the father-son relationship and the mother-daughter relationship.
Okay.
What does a son need from his dad? What does a daughter need from her mother?
Okay. A lot. Far too much than we have to offer. Right? It is one of the most ludicrous relationships, I think, set up that we will always be required of more than we can offer. But what a son needs from a father, all right, is I would say probably three things, right? The first needs to know that the father, like I said earlier, he has the father's attention, right? I have my father's eyes. He notices me, okay? He's in, I am in his mind and in his heart somewhere. The second is that I have my father's pleasure, that there is some aspect of, I know that my dad actually likes me, right? And then the third, and forgive me for being so repetitive, but is that I have my father's intention, that there is something about my dad that says he wants something for me and is actually moving forward with plans to create that into my life. So I think those three things are primary, and one summary is what I've already said, is this idea of blessing. That the words of a man, particularly of a father to a child, and this applies to both son and daughter, from a father to a child, are like fuel, are like food. We eat them up as if they are life itself. And so for a father to be very intentional about what he says and blessing the child, that I think is the number one thing that we can do, but it comes through those other three things. You don't bless someone you don't have pleasure in. You don't bless someone you're not intentional with. You don't bless someone that you don't have the attention of. So that would be the father and the son. I think for the mother and daughter, I think for a daughter, she needs some sense of, is my voice important, and is my voice strong, and can I be both beautiful and fierce at the same time? That is there value in who you are as a girl. And the mother, I think, is the one that is kind of coaxing and calling that out and creating the space for that daughter to discover both her strength and her beauty at the same time. So it's a little bit different of a rite of passage process for dads and boys and mothers and girls. But I think those are some of the things that the girls and boys need.
So for these parents of, let's say, teenagers, what should they be doing right now? Should they be thinking through those categories of attention and intention? Are there things that you have noticed maybe even arise in the past decade that are new challenges to masculinity and femininity?
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of a broad option, but anything come to mind as we talk about
Yeah.
it?
So the first question is, what should parents be doing now?
Right.
Right now. There's two things that I would say, regardless of the age of your child, if they're 2 months old or 20 years old, you as a parent, the first thing you need to do is take account of or read or be aware of your own life and your own story. All right. It's so much of parenting is focused on the child, but I believe that who we are as parents has far more of an impact on them than we ever believe. There's one of the researchers, he actually says the number one element or variable that creates a secure child and their ability to have secure relationships in their world is the degree to which the parent has done their own story work, know their own life, know their own heart, know what's been going on for them, how they've been wounded, how they've been shaped, what their character is, and who they are in the world. So that's the number one thing, regardless of how old your child is, to attend to your own heart. And that can be some of what happened to you as a kid. How are you fathered? How are you mothered? What are some of the good and the bad that come from that? And how are you still carrying that around? One person said that, what happens in your life as a child, if that's not attended to, will leak out on your children. So we have to be attentive. But then the second piece is, what do I do right now with, my 14-year-old, as you've said, and whatever, is to pause, don't panic, and begin to think, where are we and what have we already done? Who is this child that I have? What do they need? And what are the things that I can do in the next year to begin to create those kinds of experiences, create those kinds of conversations for me to have with that child, so that next year, 2 years from now, 20 years from now, I don't have regret. So
what about moms and their sons and dads and their daughters? Are there anything like that's uniquely different when you kind of
the cross-gender thing?
Yeah.
Well, dads are far more involved in both children than moms are. Okay. So, which is a little interesting. So fathers have what I call this nuclear power plant in their hearts, that when it is firing and on all pistons and everything is going well, it actually produces life and light and warmth for all the people around them. Okay. And that is both sons and daughters. So for a father and a son, the father is very involved in that process. And actually, again, to the history of Rites of Passage and all of that, there needs to be a removal of that boy from the world of women and escorted kind of into the world of men, invited to the table to come sit with the men, and we're going to expect man things from you, and so that he can then be returned to the world of women as a man and not a boy. Okay, so the world of men need to take the boy away from the women in order to return him as a man. That's this piece of Rite of Passage. Now, the father's role in a daughter's life is he's not going to teach her how to be a woman. And I think far too often the father is actually binding the daughter to him in some ways that are not helpful. What he needs to do is the blessing piece that I already mentioned, but then also the delight of her. Does she delight him? Is he delighted in her? Is there a sense of joy and companionship and love and exploration of who she is? And then the third piece is a platforming of, hey, daughter, sweetheart, let me platform your voice. Let me give you a place where I will use my strength to clear the crowd for you to be seen, for you to be heard. That, I think, is what fathers can do uniquely for their daughters. And mothers and sons.
Yeah, what about mothers and sons?
Yeah, mothers and sons, it's an interesting thing because for the most part, and this is a generality, but for the most part, mothers provide a lot more of that early childhood nurture than dads do. Also in our society, as I was talking about education, boys often go off to school, and the adults that are around in school are primarily women. So What moms need to do for boys is support the dad in having him take the boy away from her, basically give him up. And that, as in my language, it's this transition from a mother's duty into a mother's delight, where she goes from being the mother now to the one who can delight in the young man and not have the responsibility of mothering him any longer. So it's a shifting process for her in sending the boy away so that he can come back home as a man, like I said.
All right. Well, Chris, we've kind of reached towards the end of our interview. I have two questions for you left. One is, do you have a final piece of advice? And then we'll ask for a resource. So is there a final piece of advice? Anything you'd like to leave our folks with at the Parenting Teen Summit?
When it comes to rites of passage, the final piece of advice that I have would be to, do something. I'm going to do A, B, C maybe. Okay. So A, do something. Something is better than nothing. All right. Anytime that the heart is turned towards the child responds. So when a parent's heart is turned towards the child is already going to be desiring of that. So do something. If it's a whole rite of passage process and it's a whole year thing, fantastic. If it's just a weekend away, fantastic. Okay, so do something. The second piece of advice, I'll go back to one of the questions I already answered, and that is, are you aware of your own story? Do you know how you've been fathered? Do you know how you've been mothered? And where have you been wounded in that, and what still needs to be healed with regard to that? And then the third piece is C, is to actually make a plan, to sit down with your spouse, to sit down with a friend, to sit down with a brother or a sister and say, this child is a gift and I want to do right by this child. And so the responsibility that I have as this child's parent, I'm going to take seriously, and I'm going to make some plans. And if I don't make plans, I know it will never happen. So make some plans, do some things, do some reading, do some, have some conversations around this and begin.
I hope your final resource then can help us know how to make a plan. Maybe, are we going to be lucky? What's the final resource?
Yeah. So the final resource is, I did write, you mentioned at the very beginning, I did write a book called The Man Maker Project, Boys Are Born, Men Are Made. And it is a book for dads that walks them through this year-long rite of passage process and breaks it down both in the understanding of things, the history of things, where we are in the world of masculinity these days, as well as some very practical steps that dads can take to gather up a group of other men that will support them, breaking down 6 characteristics, and then walking through to a final ceremony with the boy. Another resource is my wife's book. Her name is Beth Bruno, and she wrote a book called A Voice Becoming. And that is a mother's journey with a daughter that is leading her through a rite of passage process. And that book comes out in January of 2018. So it's with the publisher now, and will be coming out. So those 2 books, Man Maker Project and A Voice Becoming. Hopefully.
So if the person watching this has a son, should they buy the book?
Well, absolutely.
Okay. I mean, so this is like such an important transition to be guided through by you and your team who have thought about this. And same thing with a mother and a daughter, right? Yeah. I mean, this is pretty important stuff, this transition from a child to an adult.
If we don't do this work, we will have a world and a generation, back to your first question, we will have a world and a generation of boys who shave. Okay? Boys in men's bodies who don't know what it means to be a man, and girls in women's bodies who don't know what it means to be a woman, and all the value and importance of what that means. If we don't do this work, we will really shape the next generation poorly. However, if we do the work, we can actually change our family trees. Whatever we've inherited, we can actually change the family tree to be completely different from what we received. So yes, absolutely read the book, but read lots of books.
Sure.
Read lots of books about this. Listen to podcasts, get online, do your research, and do something.
Well, I just think it's very encouraging, Chris. Thanks for being a part of this interview. And thanks for working so hard for this cause to help moms and dads be better moms and dads. And, you know, I'm a father of a son and a daughter, and so I'm very curious about this, especially as they approach these transitions. So again, thanks for your work, and thanks for your dedication to the gospel, and thanks for doing this interview.